They called him a genius. They called him a rising star in neurosurgery. But no one ever asked who made his breakfast at 5 a.m. every day for 18 years, who walked to work in the snow with holes in her shoes so he could have lunch money. No one ever asked about me. I'm Gloria Evans. I'm 72 years old. And while everyone applauded my son's success from a rooftop champagne gala, I stood outside that same building, not even invited. But I wasn't there to eat. I was there to watch him sign something, a lease agreement, with me. I didn't plan on raising a doctor. I planned on raising a good man, someone kind, someone who would remember the hands that raised him. But life has a way of surprising you, especially when you give everything you have and ask for nothing back. I was 37 when my husband died, hit by a drunk driver on his way home from the night shift. He was a quiet man, gentle with words, and proud of being a city bus mechanic. We weren't wealthy, but we had a little routine, a little house, and one little boy, Thomas. After the funeral, everything changed. Insurance barely covered the cost of his burial. I had no degree, no backup plan, just a boy with big eyes and fever every time winter came early. I took the first job I could find, shelving books at the public library. Minimum wage, no benefits, but quiet. And in the quiet, I made a promise to myself, Thomas will never feel poor. So I woke up at 5 a.m. every day. I made oatmeal, packed his lunch, walked 5 blocks in the cold, opened the library at 7 a.m., smiled at strangers, and stacked books with calluses on my fingers. I took extra shifts during summer reading programs so he could afford science camp. I skipped dental checkups so he could have a decent backpack. I never bought new shoes, just glued the soles until they curled. He never noticed. And honestly, I didn't want him to. When he got accepted into Johns Hopkins on partial scholarship, I cried for 2 days straight. Not because of pride, but because the numbers didn't add up. I would have to work weekends. I'd have to let go of the part-time cleaning gig I did for a neighbor and pick up evening inventory at the library archive. But I did it, quietly, without fanfare. I didn't go to his white coat ceremony. I told him I had a cold. The truth was, I couldn't afford the flight. Still, I watched the live stream. I saw him walk across that stage, his posture tall, his smile wide, and I felt full, empty and full at the same time. That's the strange thing about being a mother. You give until your own name vanishes, and somehow that's still not enough. Years passed. Thomas grew into a man I barely recognized. Expensive suits, platinum watch, a cold, polished wife named Madison who greeted me with the kind of smile people reserve for strangers in elevators. I wasn't invited to their wedding. He told me it would be a small gathering. The photos online showed 300 guests, a garden in Tuscany, and champagne towers. But I stayed silent. Every birthday, I sent a card. Every Christmas, I baked cookies. Every time he changed jobs, I mailed a handwritten letter telling him I was proud. I kept my distance because that's what he seemed to want. But a mother always hopes that maybe one day they'll turn around and say, "Thank you. I remember." That day never came. Then one Thursday morning, he called me out of the blue. "Hi, Mom. Just wanted to let you know, we're opening my new clinic. Top floor of the Sky Vista Tower downtown. There's a celebration dinner on Friday night. Just a heads up. Madison's parents and a few hospital partners will be there, so might be a little formal." It wasn't an invitation. It was a disclaimer. But I went anyway. I put on my best dress, navy blue, a little faded at the cuffs, brushed my hair, took the train, rode the elevator up to the 40th floor. The rooftop restaurant was glowing, marble floors, hanging orchids, soft jazz, humming through the air. I stood at the hostess table. She checked the list. My name wasn't there. I saw Thomas at the center table, laughing, clinking glasses, standing beside a sign that read, Dr. Thomas Evans, Neurosurgical Innovator of the Year. I walked up and smiled. "Hi, sweetheart. I think there's been a mix-up. There's no seat under my name." He looked at me, blinked, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Mom, maybe it's better if you grab something downstairs. This place is a little upscale. I don't want you to feel out of place." I stood there. All the oxygen left my lungs. Madison nodded beside him. "It's okay, Mrs. Evans. There's a little deli on the corner that's probably more your speed." I didn't cry. I smiled. Because in that moment, I remembered something very important. Earlier that week, Thomas had signed a 10-year lease for his clinic on the top floor of that very building. Ding, with a company that I own. My name isn't on the sign, but it's on the deed and on every page of the lease contract. I watched him sign it through a one-way glass across from my attorney. He never asked who the landlord was. He didn't care. But he will. This isn't just a revenge story. This is a story about remembering who you are when the world, when even your own children, try to erase you. And me? I may not have had a seat at that dinner, but the entire building belonged to me. I didn't leave right away. After Thomas looked me in the eye and told me I didn't fit the rooftop restaurant, I stood there for a few seconds pretending to read the art on the wall behind his head. It was some abstract mess, brushed red and black streaks over a white canvas, probably called something like modern tension. Fitting. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. That would have been easier, honestly. He was polite, professionally distant, the same tone I'd heard him use with waiters, Uber drivers, and, once, his building's janitor. It was the tone of a man who wanted the world to know there were ranks, and that I was not on his level. I nodded and said something like, "Of course, honey, you enjoy." And then I turned around and walked toward the elevator, holding my coat just a little tighter. When the doors closed, I stared at my reflection in the mirrored panel, the soft lines in my face, the crow's feet near my eyes, the tired little woman with her hands folded neatly in front of her purse. And for a split second, I wondered, when did I become invisible to the person I gave everything to? That's the part that hurts the most, doesn't it? It's not the insult. It's the erasure. Not being yelled at, just being omitted. I took the train home that night with my coat still buttoned all the way up. Not because I was cold, but because it felt like the only thing holding me together. When I walked into my apartment, quiet, neat, filled with framed photos of Thomas through the years, I stood by the bookshelf and didn't move for a long while. There's a picture of him on his 6th birthday, frosting on his nose, holding a toy stethoscope. I'd stayed up 2 nights knitting him a red sweater that year because he saw one in a catalog we couldn't afford. He wore that sweater every day until the sleeves stretched past his hands. Now I was too unfitting for his upscale parties. I know I'm not alone in this. There are so many mothers, grandmothers, women like me who gave everything and now sit quietly at kitchen tables while their children post photos of dinner parties they weren't invited to. Have you ever felt like that? Like you've been quietly erased by the people you sacrificed the most for? If you have, just nod to yourself. Or drop a word in the comments later, no pressure, just one word that captures how you felt in that moment. Mine, discarded. 2 days after the dinner, I got a call from Thomas. He wanted to double-check something about the lease agreement for his clinic. His voice was casual. Just paperwork stuff. But I could hear the tension under it. Funny how small people feel when they need help from someone they just dismissed. I told him he'd need to go through the property manager. Yeah, sure. Who even owns the place anyway? He asked. I smiled. Just an investment group, I said, which wasn't a lie. Because I'm the investment group. Back in 2005, when the library where I worked downsized and offered buyouts to senior staff, I took the check. It was small, but I added it to the quiet savings I'd built from every cleaning side job, every coupon, every skipped haircut. I reached out to a woman named Maeve, an old friend from the circulation desk, who had since started working in commercial real estate. She introduced me to a small circle of women like us, widows, divorcees, secretaries who had quietly become investors. Over time, our pooled money turned into real holdings, parking lots, small buildings. Then one day, an old high-rise downtown came up for redevelopment. I hesitated, but something inside me whispered, "You gave everyone else a future. Maybe it's time to claim your own." So I did. Sky Vista Tower became one of our quiet holdings, managed by a third-party firm under an LLC name no one would tie to me. And I never told Thomas, because part of me was afraid that if he knew, he'd only want something from it, and the other part of me wanted to know who he really was. Without knowing, I could help him. Now I did. Later that week, I walked past the tower just to see it from the sidewalk. There was a new sign, Evans Neurological Institute, 40th floor, in bold silver lettering. My name, not mine. I went into the lobby and saw the cleaning crew. One of the women, Rosalinda, had been working that route for 5 years. I knew her because we once folded brochures together at a church event. She didn't recognize me at first. Then her eyes widened. "Ms. Gloria?" she said. "What are you doing here?" I looked around. "Just checking up on something I own," I said softly, and we both smiled. The irony burned a little. Thomas thought I wasn't good enough to sit at his table, but the truth was, every inch of that table sat on a floor I helped pay for, a ceiling I built, a space I made possible, not with degrees or titles, but with unseen sacrifice. And now, he was tied to me whether he liked it or not. A 10-year lease, with steep early termination penalties. Locked in, he'd excluded me from one dinner, but I now had the power to determine whether or not his entire career had a roof over its head. And I wasn't angry, I was just done being invisible. Because this isn't just about being humiliated. It's about reclaiming the dignity that got buried under decades of, "Mom, can you?" I looked up at the tower again. Let him climb. But now, I hold the ground beneath his feet. There's something especially cruel about being forgotten while you're still alive. I don't mean forgotten like a birthday missed or a phone call unanswered. I mean forgotten like you've been erased from someone's sense of who they are. Like your presence, your love, your sacrifices never existed in the first place. That's what it felt like that night. After Thomas told me I didn't belong at his dinner, I left without a word. I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to give Madison the satisfaction of watching me flinch. But I did flinch, just not in front of them. The elevator ride down was quiet. No one else in the car, just me and the sting. I remember looking out the glass panel as we descended, seeing the lights of downtown shimmer across the skyline. I used to think those lights meant something, ambition, hope, the promise of a better life. But in that moment, they just looked like illusions, distant and cold, like my son's eyes when he told me I'd feel more comfortable somewhere else. The train ride home was a blur. I clutched my purse like a lifeline and stared at the seat in front of me. Around me, strangers looked at their phones, nodded off, yawned. Life kept going. But inside me, something stopped. Not just the embarrassment. That fades. What doesn't fade is the realization that someone you raised no longer recognizes you as someone worth including. I wasn't invited. That much was clear. But what stung more wasn't the missing name on the guest list. It was the missing space in his life. No chair, no plate, not even a passing, "Mom, are you okay?" when I showed up unannounced. He saw me and still didn't see me. When I got home, I left the lights off. My apartment felt smaller that night, or maybe I just felt smaller in it. I walked straight to the bookshelf and sat on the floor. That's where I keep the box. Every mother has a box, the one with school drawings, hospital bracelets, birthday cards, half-written notes that once said, "I love you more than dinosaurs." I opened the lid slowly. Inside, Thomas lived in full color. The baby blanket I crocheted during midnight feedings. The spelling bee ribbon he cried over because it was only second place. A Father's Day card he made for me in 3rd grade because he noticed that I filled both roles. "You're my mom and my dad. You work harder than anyone. One day I'm going to buy you a house." I laughed. Not out loud, just that kind of breathy laugh that barely makes it past your chest. The kind that feels more like grief than humor. He had forgotten all of it. Or worse, he remembered and didn't care anymore. The next morning, I took the card out of the box and put it on the kitchen table. I sat with it while I had my coffee. It was yellowed and bent at the corners. Written in blue crayon with a backwards R in the word harder. He was 8. I was 41. And tired and worried all the time. And I still made it work. Now he was 38. Rich, healthy, living in a condo with high ceilings and marble floors. And I wasn't even worth a seat at his celebration. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't scream. It just settles. It finds you in the quiet moments, when you're slicing vegetables for one or watching a show you used to laugh at together. Only now it's just noise in an empty room. That night, I made myself a grilled cheese sandwich and sat at the kitchen table with the Father's Day card propped up like company. I didn't have the appetite, but I ate every bite because that's what you do when you've trained yourself to never waste. Thomas would have thrown it out. He always hated leftovers. The phone didn't ring that week. No apology, no awkward text, nothing, and I knew in my bones that it wouldn't come. Because to apologize, you have to believe you've done something wrong. And Thomas didn't. To him, it made perfect sense. I was no longer part of the image he wanted to show the world. The mother who raised him had been replaced with an elderly woman who wore outdated clothes and spoke too softly. He had filed me away like an old yearbook, nostalgic in theory, but not something you bring to dinner with colleagues. That's when the grief turned into something else. Not anger, not yet. It was something quieter, something colder. It was the understanding that I had done everything right, and it still wasn't enough. I hadn't abandoned him. I hadn't failed him. I had simply outlived my usefulness in his eyes. And that's what broke me. I stood up and washed my plate, put the card back in the box, closed the lid, and for the first time I said it out loud to no one. You don't deserve me anymore. I didn't mean it like revenge. I meant it like survival. And maybe that was the moment I started to become more than just someone's forgotten mother. Maybe that was the moment I started becoming me again. It was a Wednesday, cloudy, quiet, the kind of day that made the city look like it was holding its breath. I woke up at 5:12 a.m., not because I had to, but because my body still thought it needed to make breakfast for someone who no longer lived here. I boiled water for tea and sat in the dark, listening to the faint hum of traffic, the radiator ticking, and the silence of a home that had once been full of purpose. And that's when I said it out loud for the second time. You don't deserve me. This time, I didn't whisper it. I said it like a fact, like something I'd known for a long time but had been too polite to acknowledge. That's the thing about mothers like me. We make excuses. We soften things. We say, he's busy, or she's under stress, or they didn't mean it like that. We protect them even when they've stopped protecting us. But at some point, you stop making excuses. Not because you're bitter, because you're awake. And that Wednesday morning, I woke up. I opened my closet and took out a navy blue box I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a folder marked Investments Private. Back in 2005, I'd made a decision that didn't fit the narrative of a tired old librarian. I used the buyout check from the library downsizing to join a quiet group of women, older like me, who pooled what little they had into real estate. We didn't meet in boardrooms. We met at pancake diners with refill coffee and shared spreadsheets across sticky tables. Some people collected antiques. We collected square footage. Over the years, I added to my share. I didn't splurge. I didn't flash it. I just kept investing, quietly, carefully. Sky Vista Tower was our crown jewel, our biggest acquisition. My name wasn't on the signage, but I held 38% of the holding company that owned it. The paperwork was in that navy blue box sitting beneath a stack of old church bulletins and recipe clippings. I used to tell myself I kept it quiet because I didn't want Thomas to feel pressure. But now I saw the truth. I kept it quiet because I was scared of learning how little he valued me when he thought I had nothing to offer. Turns out I was right to be scared. That realization didn't bring rage. It brought clarity. For decades, I thought that if I was patient enough, loyal enough, giving enough, my son would one day turn around and say, "Thank you. I see you now." But that moment never came. And I realized It wasn't coming. Not because I wasn't worthy of it, but because he had stopped looking. So I made a list, not of things to buy or revenge to plot. A list of things I had forgotten about myself. I graduated with honors from a community college when Thomas was 4. I read 84 books in 1 year. I taught myself Excel formulas at 56 years old. I once stitched an entire quilt by hand while recovering from pneumonia. I built a real estate portfolio with the salary of a library assistant and 0 outside help. I didn't make that list to brag. I made it to remember. Because when you've been someone's mother for so long, you forget that you are a whole person too. That evening, I walked downtown. It was drizzling. The kind of misty rain that left your jacket damp, but your spirit alert. I stood across the street from Sky Vista Tower and just stared up at it. That's when I saw Thomas coming out of the revolving doors. He was smiling, holding a to-go coffee, talking to a man in a sleek blue suit. They laughed, shook hands, walked off in opposite directions. I watched my son walk away. Confident, composed, completely unaware that the woman who gave him life was standing 50 feet away, holding an umbrella from the dollar store. And you know what? I didn't feel invisible anymore. Because suddenly, I saw everything. I saw that he didn't need more of my sacrifices. He needed the consequences of ignoring them. I saw that I had spent 40 years trying to prove my worth to a child who benefited from it every single day and still couldn't say, "You matter." And I saw that the power I thought I'd lost was never gone. It had just been waiting for me to choose myself again. That night, I opened a new folder on my desktop. I named it The Beginning. I scanned all my ownership documents. I made appointments with my attorney. I updated my will. I reached out to an old friend who now worked in PR. Because if the world was going to know Dr. Thomas Evans, the celebrated neurosurgeon, then they were also going to know the woman who built his foundation brick by quiet brick. This wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about restoration. Of name. Of voice. Of place at the table. Or maybe, more than that, it was about building my own damn table. People assume rebirth feels like fireworks. Big, loud, cinematic. But mine began in the quietest way possible. I changed my email signature. From Gloria Evans, retired librarian, to Gloria M. Evans, principal investor, GM Holdings. That's it. No announcement, no confetti, just a few clicks and a deep breath. But it felt like a declaration, not to the world, just to myself. The next step wasn't revenge. It wasn't even confrontation. It was structure. I met with my lawyer, David, on a Tuesday. We'd worked together once years ago on a rental dispute I helped a friend resolve. He remembered me, not because I was flashy, but because I showed up with a typed spreadsheet and a highlighter. I laid out my documents, ownership papers, lease agreements, tax filings. He blinked, then he smiled. "Ms. Evans," he said, "you got yourself a small empire here." I nodded. Not proudly, just plainly. I want to protect it. We got to work. David helped me restructure my holdings into a trust. He made sure I had legal clarity if I ever chose to disclose my ownership to Thomas, or more importantly, if I ever chose not to, and I wasn't planning to. Because this wasn't about embarrassing him. It was about never letting myself be erased again. The days that followed were routine on the surface, but beneath them, something fundamental had shifted. I made coffee every morning, but I didn't linger by the window waiting for a call. I cooked dinner, but I didn't set a second place at the table out of habit. I passed the hallway photo of Thomas in his graduation cap and didn't feel that ache anymore. It wasn't numbness. It was something cleaner, sharper, like closing a door, but leaving a light on in the hallway, just in case. One evening, I returned to Sky Vista Tower, not to visit Thomas's clinic, but to meet with the building manager. We discussed updating the lobby, replacing some fixtures, adding security to the rooftop entrance. "We want it to reflect the level of professionalism our tenants deserve," I said. He agreed. I didn't mention my son once. But as we finished our meeting, I glanced at the security monitor. There he was on the 40th floor speaking to a nurse, laughing. For a moment, I watched. He looked like the man the world respected, but I knew what the world didn't. He was building his legacy on the roof of a woman he had tried to leave behind. And yet, I didn't feel satisfaction, not the kind people expect in a revenge story. What I felt was rooted, like I'd planted myself firmly in my own story for the first time in decades. That weekend, I did something small but monumental. I booked a suite at the Lake House Resort 2 hours outside the city. I'd read about it years ago in a travel magazine, but always told myself I didn't belong in places like that. It seemed too extravagant, too indulgent for someone like me. But now I knew better. So I packed a simple bag, 2 books, a sweater, my walking shoes, and I drove. The suite had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a still silver lake. The first morning I woke up to birdsong and made tea in a ceramic mug with my initials painted on it by hand. I sat on the deck and did something radical. I allowed myself to feel joy without permission. No one needed to approve. No one needed to know. This moment, this space, it belonged to me. I journaled every morning, not about Thomas, not about the past, but about myself. What I liked, what I feared, what I missed about the woman I used to be before I became just his mom. I wrote about how I wanted to go back to painting, about maybe taking that beginner's pottery class down the street, about getting new glasses, not because mine were broken, but because I wanted to see the world differently. And slowly, the sadness that had wrapped around me like an old coat began to loosen. Not disappear, but loosen. Enough to breathe. On the last night at the lake, I wrote a sentence in my journal I hadn't expected. I am not angry anymore. I am just done being quiet in places where I deserve to be heard. When I returned to the city, something had shifted. I moved through the streets like someone with a center, not a shadow. I didn't check my phone. I didn't hope for an apology, because what I had now was worth more than that. I had myself, and I wasn't hiding her anymore. Let Thomas have his parties. Let Madison smile her paper-thin smile. Let them believe they stood on their own 2 feet. I knew the truth, and for once that was enough, because the woman they overlooked was about to become the one thing they couldn't ignore. You don't always need to make noise to be heard. Sometimes silence is loud enough. It was a crisp Thursday morning when everything shifted, again. Not dramatically, not in front of a crowd, but with the kind of weight that makes your chest tighten in quiet triumph. I had just come back from the grocery store. My canvas tote still had apples inside when my phone buzzed. It was a message from David, my lawyer. Gloria, I thought you should know. Thomas's clinic just submitted a maintenance request for the HVAC. It's going through your approval system. Your name will be on the service response, unless you want it routed differently. I stared at the message for a few seconds, then typed back, no need to hide it anymore. Then I set my phone down, made myself a cup of tea, and opened the window just enough to feel the wind across my face. I knew what would happen next. The building's repair team would contact the clinic to confirm access for the technicians. The technicians would show up with paperwork. That paperwork would have my name, not an alias, not a legal shell, just Gloria M. Evans, the woman who raised him. I wasn't trying to humiliate Thomas. I just stopped protecting him from the truth. And that truth was simple. I was no longer in the background. I was in the frame now, whether he liked it or not. Later that afternoon, I got a call. Mom? It was the voice of someone trying not to sound rattled. Yes? I didn't realize. You're part of the ownership group? I didn't answer right away. I took a sip of tea. I'm not part of the group, Thomas. I own the largest share. Silence, then. Why didn't you tell me? I let that sit for a moment. Would it have changed how you treated me at dinner? More silence, a longer one this time. I didn't mean to hurt you. But you did. You could hear it in his breathing, how hard he was working to keep control of the conversation. He was used to being the one with power, with calm, with image. But the ground had shifted, because now he was standing in a tower that I held the title to. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't throw anything back in his face, I just said the truth. You asked me to leave a dinner in a building I own. That's not something I'll forget anytime soon. Mom, I'm not angry, Thomas. I'm just not covering for you anymore. He asked to meet. I said no, because sometimes no is the most loving answer you can give someone who's lost their compass. That weekend I received a letter, handwritten, from Madison. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. It was short, carefully worded, almost too careful. She apologized, not for the dinner, not for the deli comment, but for overlooking your presence in ways I didn't realize until recently. That's what she called it. Overlooking, as if I'd just been standing behind a curtain the whole time. I folded the letter and placed it in the same box where I kept Thomas's childhood drawings. Not out of sentiment, out of record keeping. A few days later, I went back to Sky Vista, not to stir anything, just to sit in the cafe on the second floor and drink coffee in peace. I brought a book. The barista greeted me by name. "Morning, Ms. Evans. Same table?" A nod. Half an hour later, 2 doctors walked by. I caught a glimpse of their conversation. "Did you hear about the owner?" "Yeah. Apparently she used to work at the public library. She owns the tower now." "No way, that's badass." I smiled, but didn't look up. That was enough. I didn't need them to clap. I just needed them to know. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had that moment, not loud or dramatic, when someone finally saw your worth after ignoring it for years? Not because you demanded it, not because you threw it in their face, but because your truth stood on its own. If you've ever had that moment, or if you're still waiting for it, I want you to hold this chapter close, because it does come. Sometimes not with fanfare, sometimes not with apologies, but it comes. And when it does, you'll know. You'll feel it in the silence that follows, the kind that doesn't ask you to shrink anymore. I walked out of the cafe that day with my coat open, the sun warming my shoulders. Behind me, the building stood tall. My name wasn't on the outside, but it didn't have to be. Everyone inside knew who held the keys now. It started with a simple mistake. A receptionist at Thomas's clinic accidentally forwarded the service request email chain to a journalist, an intern, actually, from a local paper that had once interviewed Thomas when he opened his first private practice. The intern noticed something odd in the documents, the name on the building's ownership line. Gloria M. Evans. He did a quick search, connected the dots, and made one call. That's all it took. The headline dropped 2 days later. Evans Tower owned by former librarian, who happens to be the mother of its star tenant. The photo was blurry, me, stepping out of a car with a reusable grocery bag. Not glamorous, not prepared, but there I was, on the homepage, underneath a sub-headline that read, "Sources confirm the neurologist's mother holds majority stake in the building housing his private clinic." I didn't see it coming. I'd spent months keeping everything discreet, quiet, dignified. No press, no gloating. But I suppose truth has a habit of leaking when it's ready. The article went viral. Not in a scandalous way, but in that slow burn sort of way people love. The story of a quiet woman outsmarting the image-obsessed elite. I wasn't quoted. I didn't comment. But the story told itself. He built his name on a rooftop. She built the rooftop. I got calls. Not dozens, but enough. Old friends, women from church. A former coworker from the library who said, "I always knew you had something the rest of us missed." Madison didn't call. Thomas didn't either. But 2 days later, I got a certified letter delivered to my door from Thomas's legal team, a formal request to clarify the extent of ownership and request that any further public disclosure be minimized for the sake of patient confidence and privacy. I read it once, then again, and then I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in a long while, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. Let me be clear. I never asked for recognition. I didn't want my name on the side of a building. I never dreamed of a spotlight. But they asked me to shrink. They asked me to leave. They asked me to vanish. so they could shine brighter. And now, without lifting a finger, the truth had risen through the cracks. That weekend, I agreed to one interview. Just one. It wasn't a national outlet, just a local radio show hosted by a woman in her 60s named Jeanette, who ran a segment called Real Women, Real Stories. I didn't prepare a speech. I just told the truth about how I once walked 5 miles in the snow so my son wouldn't miss a science fair, about how I skipped meals to afford college books, about how I was told by that same son that I didn't belong at his table, and how, through quiet years and steady hands, I built something no one could take away from me. When Jeanette asked if I was angry, I said, "I'm not angry. I'm just done asking for a seat." Let me ask you something. Have you ever had to watch someone you raised turn their back on you? Not with cruelty, but with something colder, indifference? If you have, I hope you remember this. Your worth isn't erased just because someone else can't see it. Sometimes the people who overlook you the most end up standing on the very ground you built. By Monday, the calls to Thomas's office had increased. Not protests, just questions. Is it true your mother owns the building? Did you really ask her to leave a dinner there? I read that you didn't know. Is that true? He stopped responding to press, closed the clinic for 3 days, canceled his next conference, and for the first time since all of this began, I didn't feel like a ghost anymore. I felt like a presence. Not loud, not angry, just undeniable. You know you've become a problem, a liability, when people stop saying your name in public. It started with a canceled gala. Every year, the Neurological Institute hosted a black tie fundraiser. Thomas had spoken at it 4 years in a row. The brochure cover always featured a clean, cropped photo of him, arms folded, white coat pristine, that perfect balance of charm and expertise. This year, no photo, no mention. I didn't even know about it until an old friend of his sent me a clipped flyer with a sticky note on top. "Is he okay? Thought you might know." Then came the whispers. Patients asking about relocation, colleagues declining meetings, a pending review of Thomas's privileges at a teaching hospital where he used to guest lecture twice a semester. None of this came from me. I didn't tell a soul to blacklist him. I didn't take out ads or write exposés. I simply stopped covering for him, and once that happened, the story took on a life of its own. People love a hero, but they adore the fall of one, especially if they sense pride was involved. It wasn't just the article that shifted things, it was what it symbolized, a son who built his image on prestige, while quietly erasing the woman who made that image possible. And once that contrast was visible, people started looking closer. There were stories, former staff mentioning how Thomas never said thank you, old friends whispering that he was always distant with his mother, that he rarely invited her to public events, small things strung together like beads, one by one, making a necklace heavy enough to choke him. Meanwhile, I said nothing. I didn't take pleasure in it. Well, maybe a little, but not because I wanted him hurt, because for once, the consequences were his to carry. He tried to reach out, a few texts, a voicemail that began, "Hey Mom, I know you're probably busy," and ended with, "Let's talk soon, yeah?" I didn't respond. I wasn't punishing him. I was just done rescuing a man who had made me feel invisible for years. A week later, I ran into Madison at a grocery store uptown. Her makeup was flawless, as always, but her tone was different. Flat, clipped, nervous. She smiled too tight. "Mrs. Evans, Gloria, hi." I nodded politely, hands wrapped around a basket of blueberries and chamomile tea. She glanced around, lowered her voice. "Things have been tense lately." I tilted my head. I'm sure they have." There was silence. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "People are starting to ask questions about the building, about your involvement." I met her eyes. "I didn't say a word, Madison. I didn't have to." She blinked. A pause. Then she said something I didn't expect. "He's not sleeping. He's not himself. You know, When people stop inviting you to the table, it changes things. I nodded again. Calm, measured. That's something I know all too well. Then I picked up my basket and walked away. You see, the collapse didn't come in a single explosion. It came like a leak in the ceiling, drip by drip. The moment you notice it, the damage is already deep. Let me ask you, quietly, have you ever watched someone's world shrink not because you struck back, but because they finally ran out of your protection? It's a strange feeling. It's not joy. It's not vengeance. It's relief. You're finally free from having to explain their behavior, patch their image, smile through their absence. You just let it fall, and it does. That night, I walked into my apartment and poured myself a small glass of wine. I turned on the jazz station, opened a book, and let the soft hum of a saxophone fill the room. No calls, no requests, no guilt, just stillness. It felt like peace, the kind that doesn't beg to be understood, the kind that arrives when you stop asking for what someone refused to give, and build it, quietly, yourself. I started keeping fresh flowers on my kitchen table, just for me. Sunflowers one week, lavender the next. A small ritual, nothing grand, but every time I passed by, I'd see them and smile, because they were mine, not a gift, not an apology bouquet, not a holiday afterthought from someone remembering me last minute. They were a choice, my choice. It's funny how the biggest emotional shifts don't look dramatic on the outside. They look like this: closing the door a little slower, not in a rush, letting the phone ring instead of reaching, saying no without explanation, choosing peace over the urge to be understood. Thomas hadn't called in 2 weeks. No letters, no texts, and honestly, it felt clean, not bitter, not empty, just clear, like finally stepping into a house after a storm and realizing the roof held. One afternoon, I found myself walking past a community center that had a sign posted out front. Free beginner's art class, Fridays at 2 p.m., open to all ages. I paused. Then I walked in. The room smelled like glue sticks and acrylic paint. Plastic tablecloths covered every surface. There was an older woman in the corner painting a pear and a teenage girl sketching the skyline from memory. The instructor looked up. "You here for the class?" I nodded. "I think I am." And just like that, I picked up a brush for the first time in 30 years. That class became my favorite part of the week. I didn't talk much, didn't share my story, but I smiled more. And the more I painted, the more I realized I wasn't filling time anymore. I was creating something. One Friday, after class, I passed a local bookstore and saw a flyer in the window. The Cost of Silence, a panel discussion on women's invisible labor and generational neglect. The title made my breath catch. I walked inside and asked for a seat. The panelists were women like me, grandmothers, caregivers, single mothers. One by one, they spoke about being overlooked, erased, expected to give endlessly without asking anything in return. And when it was time for the audience to speak, something pulled at me. I stood up. "I spent most of my life being good," I said. "Quiet, accommodating, useful. Until I realized being useful isn't the same as being valued." I didn't mention names, or buildings, or dinners. I just told the truth. Afterward, a woman caught up to me on the sidewalk. She looked to be in her 60s, kind eyes, shoulders curled forward like she'd spent years trying to take up less space. "You put into words what I couldn't," she said. We hugged. Two strangers who understood each other without needing the backstory. Sometimes that's all we really want, to be understood without having to plead. And you, if you're reading this or hearing my voice, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized you were asking for scraps from someone you once gave everything to? If you have, you're not weak. You're just ready. Ready to reclaim that energy, that dignity, that space. You don't have to wait for someone to say you mattered. You already do. One night that week, I passed by Sky Vista Tower again. I didn't look up, didn't pause, just walked by, heels clicking softly on the pavement as if it were any other building. Because to me now, it was. Not a symbol of pain, not a monument to erasure, just concrete and steel. My life didn't orbit around it anymore. I got home, made some tea, and pulled out the latest painting from class. It wasn't good. The proportions were off, the shading too flat, but I loved it because it was mine, made with my hands, my time, my new energy. Thomas wasn't calling, and I wasn't waiting. That was the real shift, not the article, not the whispers, but the moment I stopped craving restoration from him and started building it from within. I wrote him a letter, not to send, not to frame, just to clear the air inside my own chest. It was early, the kind of quiet morning where the city feels like it's still asleep. I sat at my kitchen table in my robe, sunlight creeping in through the blinds, a cup of Earl Grey steeping beside me, and I picked up a pen. Dear Thomas, I want you to know I remember everything. Not the headlines, not the phone calls that stopped, not even the dinner that never was. I remember you barefoot at 4 years old, crying in the hallway because you thought I left when I'd just gone to check the mail. I remember your graduation day, how you didn't want to wear the sash I saved for, but I brought it anyway. I remember holding your hand the day your father left and promising you that I'd never do the same. I kept that promise. But somewhere along the line, you stopped needing me and mistook that for meaning I didn't matter. You didn't push me out all at once. You chipped away. Little sighs when I offered advice, changing the subject when I brought up memories, inviting me late, or not at all. I told myself you were busy, stressed, building something, but deep down, I think I knew. You were editing me out of your story. And worse, you expected me to thank you for it. You might think I'm angry, but the truth is, anger would still mean I'm holding space for you. I'm not. I'm writing this not to change your mind, but to unchain my own, because I realize now, I gave you too much. Not just my money, not just my labor, but my silence. And silence is a kind of permission. But I'm done being quiet. You don't get to be the man who put me on a lease and left me off the guest list. You don't get to call it a misunderstanding when it was patterned, repeated, intentional. You don't get to look surprised when people finally see what you've tried to bury. You see, Thomas, I'm not looking for revenge. I'm looking for air, for dignity, for distance. And now, I have it. I sleep better now. I laugh at things again. I'm painting still lifes badly but joyfully. And the space you used to fill, it's now filled with me. I folded the letter slowly. No tears, no rage, just a sense of quiet, completion. I placed it in a drawer beneath the dish towels, somewhere soft, somewhere no one would think to look, because it wasn't for him. It was for me. Later that evening, I sat on the balcony with a blanket across my lap and watched the sky move from blush to indigo. I didn't replay our conversations. I didn't wonder if he'd call. I didn't ache. And that was new. Let me ask you something gently, from one woman to another. Have you ever written a letter you never sent just to finally say what you couldn't say out loud? Sometimes that's all healing is. Not a big gesture, not a speech. Just the quiet decision to put it on paper and let it live there instead of inside you. They say closure comes from conversations, but I think it also comes from release, from knowing what you would have said and choosing peace instead. The next morning, I cleaned the apartment. Fresh sheets, a vase of lilies. I didn't know what was next, but I knew it wouldn't be about him anymore. And that was enough. I didn't tell anyone it was my birthday. Not because I was sad, not because I expected them to forget, but because for the first time in years, I didn't need the reminder. I woke up early that morning, just before the sun, and brewed my favorite coffee. I let it sit a little longer on the stovetop, just to fill the kitchen with that warm, toasted smell I've always loved. There was no text from Thomas, no flowers, no surprise calls, and that was fine, because this year I didn't wait for love to show up. I made space for it instead. Around 9 a.m., I walked down to the park wearing a scarf I'd knitted myself. It wasn't perfect. The left side curled a bit where I'd dropped a stitch, but I wore it anyway, proudly. There's a little bench by the lake that I used to sit on when Thomas was small. Back then, he'd chase ducks while I read used paperbacks from the library's free bin. This time, I just sat with my thermos and looked at the water, and it hit me. I had survived every version of being invisible. The overlooked mother, the silent invitee, the don't make it about you woman in the family text threads. And now, I wasn't any of those things. You might not understand this if you haven't been there, but there's something sacred about making a celebration for yourself. No decorations, no photos, just peace. A quiet, private honoring of the years you gave, the ones that hurt, and the fact that you're still here. I treated myself to lunch at a tiny French cafe tucked on a side street. I sat by the window and ordered soup and a glass of wine. The waitress brought out a complimentary Madeleine when she found out it was my birthday. "No one else coming?" she asked kindly. I shook my head. "Just me." She smiled and said, "That's my favorite kind of table." Afterward, I went home and opened a small gift I bought weeks ago, a silver necklace with a charm shaped like an open book. On the back, it was engraved, "I stayed, I rose." It wasn't expensive, it wasn't flashy, but it felt like mine. I didn't look at social media that day, didn't check to see what Thomas posted, didn't wonder if he remembered, because it didn't matter. Not anymore. I spent the evening painting. A still life of a coffee cup and an old pair of reading glasses, objects that never forgot me. I listened to Ella Fitzgerald and hummed along off-key, feet tucked under the blanket I keep on the couch. And at one point, in the middle of a brushstroke, I paused. Not because I was tired, not because I was sad, but because I realized this is the first year I didn't wish someone would show up and make it right. There was nothing left to make right. Just a life to keep living. Let me ask you something gently. When was the last time you celebrated yourself? Without permission, without guilt, without waiting. If it's been too long, I hope you do it soon. Not because someone finally remembered, but because you finally did. That night, I made myself a small slice of chocolate cake, the kind with the thick ganache icing that sticks to the fork. I lit a single candle. No song, no audience, just me. And I made a wish I've never said out loud. Let me never again forget what I deserve, especially from myself. I blew out the candle and smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because, for the first time in my life, I didn't need it to be. Spring arrived quietly that year, no fanfare, just a slow warming. Crocuses pushing through tired soil, a breeze that no longer bit. I packed up my apartment in 3 days. It was easier than I thought. I didn't cry over dishes, didn't cling to books I hadn't opened in years. I let go of the chair Thomas had once spilled juice on, the coat I wore to his graduation, the picture frames I never refilled. Some things aren't worth carrying when you're walking into something new. I moved 2 towns over, not far, but far enough. A small cottage at the edge of a lake where the evenings hum with crickets and the mornings belong to birds. The realtor asked if I was downsizing. "No," I said with a smile, "I'm rightsizing." Thomas never found out I moved. Or if he did, he never asked. There was no dramatic final call, no apology letter, no race to the airport, and that's what made it feel real. Closure didn't come wrapped in regret. It came in non-response, in peace that didn't require performance. Some people will never understand what they lost, and that's not your job to explain. On my last day in the city, I walked past Sky Vista Tower one final time. Not to confront, not to reclaim, just to say goodbye. I stood across the street, coffee in hand, the wind teasing at my sleeves. The building was just glass and steel again. No memories, no pain, no weight. For years, it had stood like a monument to my erasure. But now, it was just a building, and I was just a woman finally walking away from it. That's the thing about survival. It doesn't always look brave. Sometimes it just looks like leaving and never looking back. Let me ask you something before we part ways. Have you ever had to walk away quietly from someone who didn't even notice you were gone? If you have, that wasn't weakness. That was wisdom. Because real strength isn't in who claps for you or who begs you to stay. It's in knowing when the door has been closed too long to keep knocking. I live by the lake now. I paint, I bake, I volunteer twice a week at the library, just like the one I worked at when I was 29 and full of hope. I laugh more. I don't check my phone waiting for messages. I don't replay moments wondering what I could have said differently. I don't flinch when I hear his name, because I'm no longer inside his story. I'm writing my own. And maybe that's the best kind of ending. Not one where justice is shouted from rooftops, but one where a woman quietly reclaims her life and lives it fully. If this story found you at the right time, drop one word in the comments that captures where you are in your journey. Just one. It might help someone else feel less alone today. Thank you for walking with me. Even in silence, I felt seen.